Okay, this is a video on closures. What are closures? And specifically, I'm going to try to focus on trying to get people to use the debugger. And the intro to this to this topic is when you're doing the Joy of React uh, project one called Wordle, Wordle, there's an inconsistency between using console.log to debug the value of state versus what you'd see displayed on the screen. And the specific issue is called a stale closure, meaning that if you print something, it can be one behind what's displayed on a screen. They're inconsistent. It's like a n-1 problem. And this n-1 problem is a common problem. There are many solutions and a lot of blog posts on stale closures, but none of them are solved or displayed by how to use a debugger. And that's an issue. And that's an issue specifically because as we move forward in our open source development, you can't do a couple tasks without having the debugger skill. And the part that surprised me was that the people that are experienced in Joy of React, who are far more experienced than I will ever be, they got by without using a debugger. And to me, that's just shocking. Like, I can't understand how they got so far without using the debugger. And I guess it kind of makes sense, but you're restricted from a couple tasks. So one of the tasks is, for instance, making Webpack plugins. So you can't debug or even understand how the series of Webpack plugins work without using the debugger. That's one issue. Then the other issue is that you can't really manage state if you don't understand when and how closures are going out of scope. And closures are a little bit different than the standard global and local scope, where local scope is defined as function scope, meaning that if I have a function and have parameters, those get pushed onto the stack, and any variables that I need to do my computation inside of a function gets pushed on the stack. And as I unwind the stack by both pushes and pops, that's how I execute my code. And so closure scope is a little different, and it is defined when I have a function here on click inside of another function, which in this case is my component. And the specific documentation that is confusing, where you can conflate the two concepts, are batching versus closures. And so batching is something that they do in React. And what the statement is that it lets you update multiple state variables, even for multiple components, without triggering too many re-renders. But this also means that the UI won't be updated until after your event handler and any code in it completes. And so this is a true statement, but it's a little bit incomplete, meaning that the way that they do the updates is via a closure. And so we're going to see that in the debugger, and you can't see that any other way. I don't, anyway, so let's just display that. So the demo for a stale closure is that I'm going to take the simplest program that I can write. And that means I'm going to generate a component. And this is, I think, either create React app or Vite. I'm not going to use effect. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a click handler. I'm going to associate that with a button. And every time I click the button, I'm going to update the count. And so I'm going to display the count here, and I'm going to click, and I'm going to print out the value of the count. So theoretically, since I put the print statement or the console.log statement after the increment, what I should see is every time I click the button, I should increment the counter, and then I should see the print. And so this will get rendered, and I should see the display. And they should be in sync, meaning that every time I click, this count here will be updated, and my console.log will be updated, and they should be the same, meaning that if I click once, I should see count 1. If I should see the display as 1. But that's not what happens. What happens is that every time I click, the display gets updated, but my console.log is always 1 behind. And so why is that? And the specific reason is because a closure allows you to run this console.log statement before this. So even though my expectation as a programmer when I'm doing synchronous programming is that I'm going to see this log after I set the count, meaning that this should execute first and then followed by this. But what closures allow you to do is it allows you to run these out of order. And specifically, the reason that that happens is because this can be like fire and forget. I can run this really quickly. There's no state updates. Whereas this is considered a state update. So the runtime will say, aha, that's going to take more time. So let me go disappear behind the scenes, stick that in a specific loop, and then figure that out. And then this is a render loop, which is different than the state update loop. And they have to coordinate with each other. But the key is that this statement will execute before the set count statement. And the only way to see that is with a debugger. And so let's start that. And so I'm going to stop. And I'm going to set my debuggers and my breakpoints in a couple places. And so the first place is I'm going to set it on use state. And so what use state is going to do is it's going to define my count variable as 0. So that's the same as saying const count equals 0. And it's going to both initialize the variable, meaning it's going to create it's going to create an address in the memory space, in the heap space, and it's going to assign that value 1, and it's going to return me a reference to that memory address, and it's going to be defined as count. Now, to view this, you have to use the watch setting in your display pane. Hit plus and then type in count. And this count is going to reflect this component scope count. And so that's important. You have to set up, it won't come out of the box like this. Okay, so that's our first breakpoint. Then the second breakpoint is when this function is activated, meaning that when I click the button, I want it to stop on count. I want to see that what the state of the runtime is when I click the button and when I update this variable from 0 to 1. And then what I'm going to do is I'm also going to break on this button. So when this button gets created, I want to see when the render loop is activated. And also, this gives me a chance to be able to like change the browser where I can hit inspect. So let's see this run. And so we're going to hit the debugger. We're going to display the browser. And so right now there's no display because nothing's been initialized yet. We're still waiting to execute this. So let's hit run. And so now we've seen that we've executed this statement and we can verify that. We can see that count is 0. It's initialized. So that's cool. And we can see two scopes. We can see a local scope called my component or component scope. And we can see global scope. So this is all cool. This is in the expectation of what's supposed to happen. Okay, so let's run and let's see if we see, okay, so now we've run the second run stop up to the second breakpoint, which means that we've displayed the button. Well, we've displayed count, which is 0, and we've displayed the button here. So now we've run this part. And now what we're going to do is we're going to inspect and we're going to see the console. So if we click on this, we'll now be able to get, because this breakpoint's here, we'll be able to get it to stop on that. So now right now, the debugger doesn't give us the option to like step anymore, right? It's just waiting for something to happen. And so when we click, now we get the debugger allowing us to step into these functions here. So set count, let's execute this by hitting the run button. It'll run to the next breakpoint. So now we've gone off and we're supposed to be executing this in the background. Now everything's halted, but it's gone off and it's going to say, okay, I'm going to take this variable. I'm going to garbage collect this. I'm going to create a new variable with a new memory address. I'm going to add 1 to it, and then I'm going to return that address to this reference count, to this reference pointer count. And now there's also created, when I'm in this function, the thing to note is that there's a closure component here. And this closure scope is only available in the debugger. You can't print this out. And the closure scope has created a copy of count. So this is funny, right? So the only other way you could, and this is on the heap, this is not on the stack. So if this were a function, you would have to put count as a parameter and it would pop that on the stack. This is different. And this count 0 is what's going to get printed out. It's not going to, because you take the closest scope first when you're executing the statement, right? And the closest scope is closure scope. It's not this global variable here. And so this is important because this will go in and out of existence. And it's important to be able to understand when this is. And so this is where the batching can come in. But right now we only have one function. So it's batched in whatever runtime batch loop there is. Okay. And we see the function set count also, right? Okay. So now we notice that set count, even though we're here and it's theoretically, run and we're done with this, it hasn't really updated count yet. It's still 0. It had the global variable still at 0, and also the closure scope is 0. Now this is a copy of this, and it's set. And so now let's execute the console.log. And so we can see the console.log. It's printed 0. It's all cool, but we haven't updated this state yet, right? So now, after we've executed this, it's still in the background. It's now no longer defined, but it's also not defined yet, meaning that we haven't updated this to a 1 yet, right? It's still, and it hasn't been rendered. Like we're still at 0. And so let's run this. And let's run again. Now we've rendered 1. It's rendered. So now this is gone. And so now we're waiting for the next breakpoint. So the issue is that we've shown here that this click statement is different than this render statement. And so the only way to really figure this out is by seeing the closure scope in the debugger. Okay, so in the next videos, we'll describe how to use the debugger in different contexts, which include like debugging Webpack plugins, which are important. That's an important scope for a developer. You can't just manage Webpack by looking for configuration settings. You have to do a systematic bottom-up and top-down approach, where top-down, you figure out what plugins you need to develop. And then the bottom-up, you have to figure out how the existing plugins are working. And you can only do that with a debugger. You can't put print statements in node module source code. That's impossible. You can't manage that way either. Okay, so that's it for this video. I'm going to